on the screen.
Very beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. I did get my hair just cut. So, all right, everybody. Good evening. My name is Valerie Elliott with Y-kiki Divers, and we're very excited about tonight's presentation. Dan always draws a huge crowd, so we'll get started here in just a minute. But of course, some shameless plug, top news. All right. So first of all, I wanted to let everybody know that we have 3 spots still available for our Great Lakes wreck diving trip to Lake Michigan. So it's going to be September 28th and 29th. We're driving up obviously on Friday and then driving back on Monday. But give us a call if you're interested in joining us at the end of this month at the Great Lakes. I have 2 charters slated with instructors leading charters. In addition, please mark your calendars for my favorite event of the year, which is Soak Your Gourd. Come on in, my friend. Front and center, right here. You get to be on screen. Yeah.
One more of my friends is supposed to be here momentarily.
That sounds perfect. So Soak Your Gourd is the annual underwater pumpkin carving contest, and we go to Mermet Springs for that event. For $50, you get an event t-shirt, lunch, and a chance to win fun and fabulous prizes. And you get to carve a pumpkin underwater. At the end of the evening is the infamous, bonfire, where we do the lighting of the pumpkins and light them on fire. So that is really the reason why you should be there. It's just a ton of fun. Great way to celebrate the fall weather. In addition, we went ahead and moved our Bull Shoals houseboat trip. So in the past, we've always done it over Columbus weekend. But this year we moved it down a little further to October 25th through the 28th, and we're only renting one 60-foot houseboat. So the flyer is up on the website. It's at the end of October. It's just a great trip down to Bull Shoals Lake, checking everything out. So we've got spots available for that. Give us a call to sign up. I wanted to make mention to everybody in the room and everybody online that our last rescue diver course of the season is going to be slated for October 26th and 27th. So this kind of goes in nicely with what Dan's going to be talking about tonight. But rescue diver is essentially where I like to see all of our customers be, is at least that rescue diver level. And usually the rescue diver class is the last piece that people need before they can earn their master scuba diver rating. So in the PADI system, master scuba diver is open water, advanced open water, rescue diver, 5 PADI distinctive specialties, and 50 log dives. This year, PADI is waiving the application fee, and that's a savings of about $75. So I want to encourage everybody, if you don't put it on the calendar, it won't happen. But rescue diver is so important. Please add it to your calendar. Last one on the schedule is going to be October 26th and 27th. Some more things to add to your calendar as you're going along, just to put a bug in your ear. My annual luau, the big pig roast that I do, is slated for November 9th. I'd like to invite all of our master scuba divers and do a big celebratory kind of event on that night. Scuba Santa, where you get to get your underwater picture with Scuba Santa, is slated for December 7th. And then we're going to have a GoPro night, which we kind of highlight all things about the, charting your path, if you will, if you maybe want to consider the professional level. That's December 10th. And then we're going to do our New Year's dive into the new year and polar bear plunge, December 31st and January 1st. And then I do want to do a shout out. I just found out that the dates for the Ice Hole Festival at Lake Okoboji in Iowa is January 29th, February 2nd. So it's, I never thought I would do that, but it is absolutely a ton of fun, and just something to say that you've done. So pretty cool. Travel related, I really want to make a couple of announcements on travel. Little Cayman, which is our trip in January, the end of January, January 18th through the 25th. I have a male share and 2 pool rooms available. So essentially 5 spots available. Riding Rock to San Salvador, Bahamas, I have 4 rooms available. So that one I kind of put on the calendar late. It's February 22nd through March 1st. And we'll be at Riding Rock in the Bahamas. And then last but not least, I just wanted to do a quick reminder that for Passport to Paradise, this is a trip to North Sulawesi in Indonesia, and it's 3 properties. And we're going to go from one property to the next. While we're diving, they'll transfer us to the next hotel, and they'll move all of our luggage to the next hotel. So it's Bangka, Manado first, Bangka, and then Lembe. And Lembe is their flagship property, and we're going to spend 5 days in Lembe. So I do have 1 meal share still left for that trip, May 30th through June 11th of 25. So keep an eye out on our calendar for travel. I'd love to have you join us. So tonight, what I wanted to do for my speaker series, hello, come on in. There's a spot somewhere, there's a chair right over here. So what I wanted to do for the speaker series is, many of you know that I got the chance to go, we did Antarctica in February of this year, and then in June, I had an opportunity to do the Arctic trip, which is up in Norway, Spitsbergen area. And it's on a big charter ship with Blue Green Expeditions. And it's just really all about, I mean, it's so cool, all the things that you get to see and do, but the cool people that I get to meet on those expeditions really makes the trip memorable. And what I want to do with my speaker series is bring some of those individuals to the store and give them an opportunity to share who they are and what they do. So tonight, and Dan has joined me multiple times. He's always so generous with his time. But tonight is Dan Orr. He has been past president of Divers Alert Network, and he is now the owner of Dan Orr Consulting, along with his bride, Betty Orr. And tonight he's going to talk about something that's he's been talking about for many, many years, the mistakes that divers make. And hopefully we can glean some information from him and avoid those mistakes. Without further ado, if everybody would please join me in welcoming Mr. Dan Orr.
You're muted, Dan.
Hey, Dan, you're muted.
Yep, Dan, you're still muted. Let me.
Remember when you were talking about that presentation you did last time?
So at the bottom of your screen, Dan, there should be a little thing. Go ahead and click that. Nope, we got you there. So it should be in your GoToMeeting screen, Dan. So maybe behind your presentation there. So you should have, no, because we're looking at your screen here. What screen do you have up there? There you are.
Okay, good.
All right, screen again.
Technology, the bane of our existence.
Supposed
Supposed to make our lives easier, but of course it also makes it more frustrating at the same time. Well, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
We can
Yeah,
hear
we
you.
can hear you. Great, Dan. Thanks.
Good, thank you. So thank you very much for giving me the invitation to present this material to you. If you can do me a favor and hold any questions till the end, I'd appreciate that. And we'll have a lot of time at the end because I'll hang around as long as you want me to. And I'll also give you my email address so you can contact me at any time for any reason about anything. I deal with a lot of aspects of the diving community and the diving industry. For example, I'm the chairman of the board of DEMA, the Diving Trade Association. I'm also the chairman of the board of a number of different groups around the country. So I'll be happy to answer any questions I can or get you connected with people who can answer those questions for me. Okay, we'll talk about mistakes. Well, first of all, let's talk about accidents. So what is an accident? It's an occurrence or event that interrupts normal procedure or precipitates a crisis. That precipitates a crisis is very important because it's generally not a single thing that automatically involves or creates an accident. It's normally a series of events or a cascade of events that transform a normal or enjoyable scuba dive into something that is far less enjoyable and possibly even tragic. It's also an undesirable or unfortunate happening that occurs unintentionally, even though when you read accident reports like I do, it appears as though these people intentionally went out to hurt themselves. It usually results in harm, injury, damage, or loss, casualty, or a mistake. And when you look at these accident reports like I do, the vast majority of those are indeed preventable. So we'll talk about scuba diving is indeed inherently safe, but it is very, very unforgiving of mistakes. This photo, by the way, was my first trip to the Antarctic. I've been there 3 times, as Valerie was talking about. I do volunteer work for Faith Ortiz of Blue Green Expeditions and volunteer to help her lead some of these expeditions if she can't go herself, or just help her when she's on the expedition. But this is a shipwreck called the Governor Norin, and the Governor Norin was a whaling ship, a whaling factory ship that caught fire when they were having a party on board, actually celebrating the end of their season. And someone accidentally kicked over a lantern, and the whale oil caught fire. And so in order to save the whale oil as much as they could and also keep from losing their passengers, they ran the ship aground. And so it's a great opportunity to dive. We actually dived it on our last trip to the Antarctic, and it is a very, very good dive site. The stern is actually about 60 feet below the surface. So why do divers make mistakes? That's what we're talking about here. They make mistakes because they may have incomplete knowledge, and that is not having all of the relevant facts to make all the decisions that we have to make for our own safety, and all the relevant facts necessary for our diving companions to make decisions for our safety as a group. Also, possibly due to poor communication. Those divers inherently may not share information, all the information necessary with their companions. So for example, I've seen situations where in a dive planning process, there wasn't a lot of communication between buddies, and actually the divers were on 2 different dive plans. So one knew he was going somewhere, the other thought they were going somewhere, and it really was a lot of confusion. I've actually seen people arguing and fighting underwater when they didn't know what each other was doing. Also, changing conditions, and that's when conditions create unfamiliar or unexpected circumstances that may actually be beyond the diver's ability to cope with those circumstances. So you need to make sure that you understand what all the potential situation is likely to be and all the potential conditions are likely to be, and make sure that your skills and your abilities are able to cope with those changes. Also, pressure. I'm not talking about the water pressure here, but I'm talking about things like time pressure. Time pressure is where people are encouraged to move a lot more quickly than they really are comfortable with. I tend to be a very, very slow person when it comes to preparation. In fact, when we are on our Antarctic trips or even the Arctic trips, I'll sometimes go up to the dive hangar where we are dressing out, and I'll be there maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours beforehand so I can take my time and make sure everything is the way it should be before I'm ready to get into the water. And so never let anybody push you to move faster than you really want to or supposed to. And that also goes for being underwater. I was doing a dive in Japan a number of years ago, and we had a dive master who was constantly encouraging us to move faster, move faster, move faster. And I don't want to do that. I'm doing the dive because I want to see things. I don't want people pushing me along, and I don't want anybody to expect me to keep up with them. So I always tend to move at the pace of the slowest person in our group. And also peer pressure. Peer pressure is extremely dangerous because that means that somebody is trying to encourage you or push you to do something that you may not feel you're prepared for. When I was Associate Dive Safety Officer at Florida State University before I went to work at Divers Alert Network, there were a number of my friends who did cave dives, recreational cave dives. And there was a young man named Sherwood who was out with a group of people that were going to do what they call pushing line. They were going to go further and further and further back into a cave system. And it was planned to take 2 days. So during the first day, they did a push of about 2,000 or 3,000 feet back in this cave. And that evening, when they were sitting around the fire, Sherwood said, "You know, guys, I just don't think that I'm prepared for tomorrow. I just don't think I really should do this." And they said, "Oh, no, you can do it. You know, you're okay. And, you know, you don't want people to leave you behind." And Sherwood finally said, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." And unfortunately, he died on that dive. So don't let peer pressure push you to do something you're not prepared for. Complexity. Sometimes we're involved in things where we're doing things that are overly complex, using overly complex equipment or overly complex procedures or overly complex circumstances. For example, my first trip to the Antarctic, I would be using equipment that I hadn't been using in quite a long time. So I decided to go a few days early and do dives in Ushuaia, Argentina, which is in the Beagle Channel, and get used to the equipment, get used to the circumstances before I use that equipment in Antarctica. And of course, Antarctica, the conditions are a lot more challenging and a lot more unforgiving. So what I made sure I was comfortable and familiar with the equipment before I went on that trip over to Antarctica. So you need to make sure that you are familiar with everything that goes on, make sure that you can deal with those complexities. And that's another reason why when I go to a new place, I never take my camera on the first dive. I want to make sure that I get comfortable with the equipment and the environment before I start carrying a camera, which is a lot more complex. Okay, complexity, we're talking about things, for example, like too many firsts. So doing too many things for the very first time. So for example, using a dry suit for the first time, or wearing a dry suit for the first time and doing a night dive, or doing a deep dive, or doing something for the first time, where things are overly complex. You don't really want to do that. While using something for the first time or doing something for the first time, some skill, for example, that you may be doing for the first time in association with other things you're doing that makes things really, really complex. Or the first time in a long time using something or doing something, because post-COVID, for example, there are a lot of people who are out of the water for a year or 2 or 3. There are people, for example, who got certified and trained when they were in college, and due to family obligations or career obligations, they had to stay away from the sport for a while and are coming back. So they want to make sure you don't overtax yourself and do things that are overly complex when you're returning to the water after being away for a long time. Because these can consider or create things called task loading. Task loading is where all these things are going on at the same time and you're having a very difficult emotional time dealing with them. And one of the aspects of that is perceptual narrowing, where it actually narrows your field of focus, narrows your field of vision, so you can only see those things that are very, very close or very in front of you. And it also, because you have perceptual narrowing, it creates something else that I think is even more difficult from a safety standpoint, and that is response narrowing. Because when you're under all of that stress, you can only respond effectively using skills that are recently used and recently reinforced. That's one reason why it is so important to practice those complex psychomotor skills before you continue to dive, and do that frequently, because a lot of these skills are skills that are very, very necessary in an emergency. And when you think about the skills that you learned in your scuba course, you learned how to exchange air, you learned how to remove and drop your weights possibly. Those are complex psychomotor skills. Most often people don't practice those skills once they leave that certification course. So they learn it, they overlearn it during the course itself, but they don't use it or practice it again. And when it comes time to use it, if they're not recently reinforced, they're not going to be able to be used effectively. I have what I call my rule of 3. That's my rule of 3 in dive preparation. If I make 3 mistakes during my dive preparation process, I rethink my readiness for that dive. So as I was mentioning before, when we do the Antarctic trips and the Arctic trips, we sometimes will use a ship that has a hangar, and I'll go up there an hour or 2 beforehand and start getting everything ready to make sure everything is the way it should be. If I make 3 mistakes in my preparation, then I'll stop and think, well, am I really prepared to make this dive? And sometimes I'll say no, and I'll say no frequently. If I feel for some reason or other, I don't feel I'm appropriately prepared, then I'll call the dive rather than put myself at risk or the people I'm in the water with at risk. Well, what we're talking about here too is to manage those risks that we experience during a dive. So a number of years ago, when Divers Alert Network was trying to create an insurance program, we went out to various insurance companies in the United States, and we said, we want to insure scuba divers. And after they stopped laughing at us, they said, well, we're not really sure if we want to do that because we think the risk is too high. And so the folks at Divers Alert Network said, no, the risk is not high at all. Diving is very safe. And so these insurance companies said, prove it. Well, we couldn't prove it. We couldn't prove it because we didn't have the denominator. We had a good idea of how many accidents there were, how many injuries there were each year, and how many fatalities there were, but we didn't have any information on the number of safe dives that are done because they've got to be in the tens of millions. So without that denominator, we could not come up with an incident of injury. So Divers Alert Network set up a program where we would collect information on dive profiles and then follow those divers post-dive and post-dive trip to see if there were any injuries that related to the dives they made. And that would give us the denominator in that equation so we could then come up with an instance of injury. So we had interns that were out collecting this data from downloading dive computers. And these interns had tough duty. First place they went were liveaboards. I mean, they spent week after week after week on liveaboards. I mean, how tough is that? And so they were out there collecting nearly 20,000 dive profiles. and they determined that the incidence of injury while people diving from a liveaboard was about 1 per 10,000 open water dives. And that's what we consider the safe standard, about 1 per 10,000 open water dives. And you may ask, well, why is it safe compared to other types of diving, which we're going to talk about? Well, for one thing, you have people on board that boat who are only there to give you the information you need to make a safe dive. You have dive guides, dive masters who give you information about the dive site, water temperatures, depth, the profiles you should be using, marine life, currents, any of those, visibility, any of those things. And they're also there to make sure that you don't do stupid things like keeping your air turned off when you do your entry into the water. So they're there to make sure that you are going to be doing safe and enjoyable dives. And you even have people in the water there that can help you in case you have a problem. So again, 1 per 10,000 water dives for liveaboard diving. We also looked at people who were doing dives from charter boats that had a dive master on board. And the incidence of injury was about the same. And again, because you had somebody there who gave you all the information you needed to have to make decisions about your dives. We also then collected dive profiles for people who were doing dives from shore, doing dives from their personal watercraft, where they had no dive master. So they had to do all those things themselves. They had to collect all the information, disseminate all the information themselves. They didn't have somebody there to help them do all of that. And we collected over 16,000 dive profiles, and the incidence of injury was 3 times higher, which makes sense because when you have those things left on your own, then sometimes you make those mistakes where you don't have those people to back you up. So it was 3 times higher than on a liveaboard. We then looked at dive professionals, where we collected a little bit over 5,000 dive profiles. And these are people who are instructors, dive masters, possibly assistant instructors, people who have responsibility for others in the water. And because they're doing a lot of ascents and descents and skill training, because you may have to move quickly up and down because somebody may be having a problem, the incidence of injury is much higher. And it's about 10 per 10,000 open water dives. When I, again, was the Associate Dive Safety Officer at Florida State, we were doing training for science divers almost every single day. And we would take people offshore where we're in a hard bottom of about 40 or 45 feet in the Gulf of Mexico, and doing a lot of skill training, ups and downs, ascents and descents, and all kinds of skill training. And so one thing I did to mitigate those risks for my staff who were doing those ascents and descents was I had them use nitrox with air dive tables, because we were using dive tables back in those days. And so we'll talk more about that later on, because that's something else I recommend with using dive computers. Then we looked at people who were doing deep dives, deep wreck dives, and cold water dives, which nowadays would probably be called technical diving. We collected over 5,000 dive profiles, and the incidence of injury was about 29 times higher, because you have people who are doing things that require a lot of work. So a lot of physical work, a lot of work to cope with the environment, and a lot of conditions that are really challenging their physical abilities. A lot of times collecting artifacts, again, doing extremely deep dives. And of course, the incidence of injury is much, much higher, but those can be mitigated by people using different gas mixtures like Trimix, for example, using different dive tables with different algorithms and a variety of other things that can mitigate those risks. But again, the risk was much, much higher. Then you look at data on fatalities, and you look at the DAN data, and the DAN data indicates fatalities in different classifications: recreational, breath hold, commercial, public safety, and so on. But we're mainly interested in recreational diving here. So in the United States, and this was from the annual report in 2017, and actually it was published in 2020, but it was the 2017, 2018 data. And there were 55 fatalities for United States citizens and Canadians. 45 from other countries, for a total of about 100 fatalities around the world. And again, when you consider the fact that there are tens of millions of safe recreational dives being done every year, then again, diving is inherently safe. So the fatalities, at least from the DAN data, 1 fatality for every 211,864 dives. Now, of course, there are other things that are as hazardous or much more hazardous in scuba diving. So when you look at fatalities in other sports, the odds of dying in things, for example, like base jumping, is 1 in 2,317. And so I have a little video here to show you about the dangers of base jumping.
You might question the sanity of these 2 guys who decided to pull off an illegal urban wingsuit stunt via narrow. As you can see, the men were Red Bull wingsuit daredevils. They actually successfully threaded the needle between 2 skyscrapers in Rio. One of the daredevils attempted to fly by one of Brazil's famous monuments. Unfortunately,
That's a hazard you normally do not expect. But going on to other activities like swimming, for example, it's 1 in every 56,587. Cycling, 1 in every 92,325. Skydiving, 1 in every 101,083. Hang gliding, 1 in 116,000. Horseback riding, 1 in 175,418. Now, I live in the great state of Idaho, diving capital of North America, and I live in the mountains. And of course, in the wintertime, people still do horseback riding. They do something here called ski drawing, where they pull people on skis from the back of a horse. And so, we do a lot of strange things here in the wintertime. Also, scuba diving is now 211,864. The odds of dying playing table tennis is 1 in 250,597. So when you look at the odds of dying on a scuba dive, it is somewhere between horseback riding and table tennis. So it really is a very inherently safe sport. So let's talk about mistakes now. Not practicing critical diving and emergency skills. So when you look at the DAN data, 39% of the certified divers who showed up in the DAN fatality database were certified for 1 year or less. Now that kind of makes sense because they have limited skills, limited experience to draw from, limited tools to deal with emergencies that take place during a dive. 35% of the people in the fatality database were certified for more than 10 years. And I can tell you absolutely that means nothing. All it means that these people were certified and had a certification card in their wallet or their purse for 10 years or longer. Has nothing to do with their skills, nothing to do with their abilities. It has nothing to do with their last dive or any dives they've ever made. So they've just been certified for 10 years or longer. A significant number of the divers in the fatality database died on the first dive of their dive trip. And when you think about that, actually, when I was talking about that, I gave this presentation not too long ago. Somebody said, well, the way to deal with that is simply skip the first dive. I mean, it sounds like it makes sense, but it really doesn't. Well, and it also makes sense because a lot of these people are people who are coming back to the sport after having been away for a long time, and they may be doing things that are beyond their emotional and physical capabilities. For example, here's a guy doing an entry, and he's forgotten to put his hand on his mask, and he's likely to flood his mask when he entered the water. So let's talk about, and I'll talk about a number of case histories during this presentation. One of them is a diver ran out of air in 60 feet of water. Now, this was an absolutely perfect diving day. Flat calm, no current, sunny skies, excellent visibility. There were a group of divers who were diving together. They've been diving together for a number of years. There were no assigned buddies. It was basically the same ocean buddy system. A buddy, somebody who was relatively nearby, attempted to share air with one of the divers who ran out of breathing gas on the dive. It was the second dive of the day. The diver and the buddy were found dead later on that day. The buddy still had 1,200 PSI in her cylinder, and both had a death grip on the primary second stage. And this was, again, the second dive of the day, which is very important. So the possible issues here, no recent familiarity with critical skills, because evidently what happened was when there was an attempt to air share, it didn't go well. They were fighting over the air, causing them both to die. There was no pre-dive equipment check because they would have known that one person might have been low on air. There was no use of a checklist or pre-dive ritual, and the person did not change their cylinder between dives. When I hear of a fatality where at least one of the divers still has air in their cylinder, the first question I ask, what dive of the day is it? And invariably, it's a second dive of the day because the first person did not change cylinders between dives. There was a young man in the Florida Keys who'd made a dive. He and his partner and his father went to another dive site. When he got to the dive site, they saw a large fish on the bottom. He put his tank on, went down to 105 feet, didn't change cylinders, ran out of air, and he actually died in his father's arm on the boat. This is a photo that I took at a quarry in North Carolina when I worked at Divers Alert Network. And this is a guy who has his equipment configured so he has no danglies. He has nothing dangling off his equipment. This is his second stage, his additional second stage, his octopus or safe second, whatever you want to call it. And it's configured. The fact it's not going to drag or catch on anything, but there's no way in the world that person's going to be able to deploy that quickly enough to satisfy your need for breathing gas. So it's good to have your things not dragging around, but you also have to make sure you can deploy it effectively if you need to in a hurry. One of the things that I think that Dan did and really did a great job of was review fatality cases. In 2008, our researchers reviewed 947 fatality records in the Dan fatality database. And these were fatalities between 1992 and 2003. We used that period of time because those were the files that had all of the information necessary to make decisions or make determinations about what caused the accident. And it was published by Dr. Petar Noble, who was the researcher at Dan. And if you want a copy of this article, this is where you can find it, the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society Journal, but it's called Causes of Recreational Diving Fatalities. And if you can't find that, let me know and I will be glad to send you a copy. Well, what they did was they looked at triggering events and the other parts of the cascade that turned into a fatality. And the initial triggering events were things that I was very interested in. And the primary triggering event was running out of breathing gas underwater. 41% of the triggering events were due to running out of breathing gas underwater, which again makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I mean, you have a pressure gauge, you have information that you can use to make decisions, but yet you ran out of breathing gas underwater. It makes no sense. So there'd be almost 400 divers that would be alive today if they could manage their breathing gas. These were all of the triggering events: out of breathing gas, entrapment, equipment problems. I honestly don't think it is equipment problems. I think it is problems with equipment. I think it is user error rather than a design flaw in the equipment. Also, rough water, trauma, buoyancy, inappropriate gas. When you look at those, almost 63% of those are things that have to do in some way with equipment. So if we could resolve equipment issues, or equipment-related issues, we could significantly reduce diving fatalities. When you look at other data, this is data that I think is also relatively important. This is the number of dives that the person made in the 12 months prior to the fatality. So again, when you look at it over on the left-hand side, you see people who are made less than 20 open water dives, which again makes some sense because they had limited skills, limited ability to draw from in case they're involved in an emergency. But then on the far right-hand side, you have people in the fatality database here that have over 300 dives in the 12 months prior to an accident. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of diving. And they still ended up in the fatality database. And part of the reason, in my opinion, is complacency, where they don't feel they need to follow the same rules you and I do to prepare ourselves for a dive. And we'll talk about something else later on, which is normalization of deviance, which I think also is very relevant to this. So this is that cascade. You have a triggering event that initiates a harmful action that ends up in an incapacitating injury that incapacitates the diver, and ultimately the person dies. And so what we need to do is to be able to stop that right there. So whenever we're confronted with a triggering event, whatever it happens to be, we resolve the issue and go on, and we never get involved in that cascade that ultimately involves a death. So we are, in fact, every single dive we make, there are things that we're confronted with where we have to make decisions. And because of our experience and abilities and comfort in the water, we make the right decision and we go on. We never feel that it was an issue. But there are people with less experience, less ability, and sometimes some other issues that they're dealing with where they don't make the correct action, don't make the correct decision, and therefore they get involved in this, this cascade that leads to a fatality. Okay, another mistake, not using a pre-dive checklist or consistent pre-dive ritual. I'm very, very pro pre-dive rituals. I do the same thing the same way each and every time I dive, and I also use a checklist to back that up. So checklists are very important. In fact, in 2012, there was a Rebreather Forum 3.0, and that was supported by Patty, Dan, and also the American Academy of Underwater Sciences. And one of the things that they determined out of that consensus position was the forum acknowledged the overwhelming evidence demonstrating the efficacy of checklists in preventing errors. That's what we want to do. We want to prevent errors. We want to prevent mistakes. Case history: diver attempted to put air in his buoyancy compensator during a perceived emergency. Whether it was a real emergency or not, he thought it was. There was no air going into his BC. So no matter how hard he pushed on that button, no air was going into his BC. Diver drowned. Possible issues here: BCD inflator was not completely connected. So the hose was against the inflator nozzle, but it wasn't connected. No pre-dive equipment check, and all that diver or their buddy had to do is push that button to see if air was coming out of the cylinder into the BCD. No checklist or pre-dive ritual to keep that from happening. Checklists, there are a lot of checklists you can find. There's some that are online. There's some that'll go on your phone. There are waterproof ones. I mean, they're all over the place. I use checklists liberally. In fact, we have checklists on our house. Every time I go on a trip, I have a checklist. I use a checklist to make sure I'm packing everything, use the checklist to make sure I'm bringing everything back. So I make sure that I have checklists for everything I do, including diving. Safety preparation, prepare yourself, your partners, and your equipment with a checklist and a consistent pre-dive ritual that I mentioned before. And it's very important to dive your recent experience, not your certification card. Your certification card is only a ticket to allow you to go diving. It has nothing to do with your recent experience or abilities, because a card doesn't expire, but your skills and abilities do become rusty. So you need to make sure that you are diving consistent with your most recent experience, because recently practiced skills and experience are essential, because once you're underwater, your certification card means absolutely nothing. Properly execute each dive as a buddy team and consider contingency. My buddy and I always talk about contingencies to make sure that if something happens, we at least have thought about what we could possibly do to deal with that. Be situationally aware. Situational awareness is extremely important. That is to be aware of your breathing gas supply and your breathing gas supply.
All right, if we get a hotel at the airport, right?
I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, breathing gas supply, and make sure that you know what your breathing gas supply is throughout the dive. Make sure that you communicate that with the people you dive with to prevent you from running out of breathing gas underwater. And that yours and your diving companion. Your bottom time, your last bottom time relative to your dive plan, your depth, the currents, visibility, be aware of all of that, again, relative to your dive plan, your position and location relative to the entry and exit point, and any overhead conditions, because they can change dramatically, and anything that could compromise your safety. So you think about those things. And if you realize that you are doing more work than you expected, that means your body's absorbing more nitrogen. That means that you are increasing your risk. And so there are things you can do, decisions you can make to shorten your bottom time, for example, increase your safety stop, or do things that will, again, reduce your risk on that dive. Learn from each and every dive. My partners and I talk about the dives we make, talks about the dives we have made, and we learn from all those experiences, because safe divers don't waste a good mistake. We all make mistakes. They learn from those mistakes, and we share that information, that learning experience, with others. Another mistake, not communicating effectively with your buddy or your diving companions. Case history, diver in distress attempted to jettison his integrated weights. Unsuccessful. He was unsuccessful because, and he drowned, he was unsuccessful because even though he'd been diving for a number of years, he had never put weight in, nor ever taken weight out of the integrated weight system on ABCD, because it had always been done by somebody else. He was certified at a resort, and the resort dive masters put the weights into his integrated weight system. They took the weights out of his integrated weight system. He never had to do that, had never practiced that skill, and the diver drowned. So he didn't know how. Possible issues here: no pre-dive communication with the buddy, no pre-dive equipment familiarization, incomplete buddy equipment check, possible limited quick release options. Because in reality, integrated weight systems don't necessarily involve quick release. In my opinion, quick release is a single movement and the weights are gone. If you have integrated weights where you don't have that option, then it's a more complex psychomotor seal, because you have to unclip or pull on one, pull on the other, hopefully at the same time, to get rid of them. But that doesn't necessarily happen. And I do know of a case where a person had so much weight in those each individual pocket that once one pocket was jettisoned, they were still negatively buoyant. So communicate. You need to communicate with the people you dive with. Communication is very important. And again, you can communicate underwater using a slate. Another mistake, not taking care of your health. This is a big, big, big issue now. And again, we talked about those triggering events that came out of that report that was done by Dan in 2008. Dan looked at fatalities more recently in 2015. The number one triggering event was no longer out of breathing gas. It was now underlying health issues. And cardiac issues are a big part of that. Case history, 54-year-old certified advanced diver, whatever that means. First open water dive in 7 years. So he'd been away from the water for 7 years. When he entered the water, he had his snorkel in his mouth, not his regulator. He struggled on the surface because his first breath was nothing but water. He became unresponsive, and the situation was he had a cardiac event, and he had no recent physical and no cardiac stress test. So he certainly should have, after having been away from the sport for a long time, he should have taken a refresher course or done a number of things to ease his way back in the water. But unfortunately, a lot of people's egos will not allow them to do that. They say, well, I've been certified for 10 years. I hear that a lot. And therefore, I don't need a refresher course. Well, when I'm away from the water for a long time, I'll take a refresher course at a resort, or I'll do things to ease my way back in the water and not feel that I can go back in at the same level I was when I stopped diving. So cardiac issues in diving, again, is a real big issue. In 2017 DAN data, they had autopsy results that were available in 29 diving-related fatalities. 55.2% of those, the cause of death or disabling condition was identified as an acute cardiac event. Diving exposes our bodies to various stressors that may create or contribute to an arrhythmia or an irregular heartbeat. The major stressors are immersion, exposure to cold, increased work of breathing. And again, folks, that's diving. Nothing we can do about immersion. Exposure to cold, we can mitigate that risk by having the appropriate exposure protection. We can mitigate the increased work of breathing by making sure that our regulators are tuned properly and regularly to make sure we're getting breathing gas without having to do a lot of work to get that. Another issue now, again, because of COVID and other reasons why people have been away from the sport for a while, emotional stress is also a contributing factor to the creation of an arrhythmia. That's another reason why it is so important, if you're away from the water for a period of time, take it slow, take it easy to get back into the water. Some of the cardiac incident signs and symptoms are just about anything. It can be pain in the jaw, toothache, shortness of breath, not necessarily the chest pain you would normally consider. For example, if you watch daytime television, Susan Lucci, who is an actress, she's had a number of cardiac events. The last one, the only sign and symptom she had was jaw pain. And luckily, she recognized that as something out of the ordinary, went to the ER, was able to be treated properly. I talked to a guy yesterday, a good friend of mine, who's a retired Navy SEAL. He was on a 10-mile bike ride, and the last 5 miles, he was kind of cooling himself down. All of a sudden, started feeling a pain in his chest and some radiation down his left arm. Decided to pedal the way back home, another 3 miles or so. By then, it started getting really bad. Went to the ER. He had a heart attack, and luckily, he survived. So you got to make sure that if there are things that are out of the ordinary, you're not feeling well, you need to make sure that you don't necessarily get in the water, and you make sure somebody knows about it and you get yourself to a medical facility. So again, about 25% of those fatalities, the person had no signs or symptoms at all, totally unaware that they had impending cardiac event. First aid for a cardiac incident, recover the person and remove the diver from the water. Now, one of the things I'm going to talk about here is something that I've just added to this. One of the problems, if you are in a situation like those divers were before, where it was kind of the same ocean buddy system, you may not be aware of the fact that your buddy has had a medical issue and has become unconscious on the water, underwater. So therefore, you need to worry about being able to find that person and recover that person. There is something that's out now. It's actually a device that is not readily on the market yet, but it will be shortly, called Divo. And it's from a company called Scuba Tech. And it is a modified inflator system that goes on your buoyancy compensator that if you stop breathing for 35 seconds, it automatically inflates your BC and brings you to the surface. And there are some safety backups there, so you don't automatically have that happen if you're in a cave, for example, or in an overhead environment. But it is something that would bring that unconscious person to the surface where it's easier for them to be resuscitated. And in full disclosure, I do consult with Divo on that equipment. So again, going on with potential cardiac event, again, recovery and remove the diver from the water. Hopefully you can do CPR, and hopefully there's an automated electronic defibrillator, which may or may not be readily available because they may not be available at all locations. So I would check to make sure that if you're going on a dive trip somewhere, on a dive boat somewhere, that you check to see if they have an AED on board. Most of them do now because of the aging diving population, but I would make sure they have one and make sure they have one that's available. And then get the person to the emergency medical services as quickly and efficiently as you can. So why do accidents occur? No recent familiarity with critical skills or equipment, limited overlearning of critical skills, no recent practice or reinforcement of basic skills and emergency skills. There is something that I think is very important called rehearsal. When I was teaching years ago in Ohio at Wright State University, we developed something we call proper pre-dive procedure, where we practiced our critical skills as part of every dive preparation. So there are different types of rehearsal. One of them is static rehearsal, where you read books about diving, you look at videos about diving, but that has limited efficiency.
In the sea, everything is connected to everything else. It is a network of individual organisms bound by the unifying force of the water itself. If we disrespect this openness and diversity, we do so at our own peril. On this day, Bernard is hoping for a glimpse of the rare Sumatran sea badger, when suddenly, disaster. On his own, his equipment unreliable, his inadequate support, Bernard makes a valiant attempt to recover, trying all the fixes he knows, but to no avail. The last thing Bernard saw was not the depths of the blue sea, but the blue screen of death.
Hopefully we won't be seeing the blue screen of death during a dive. The other type of rehearsal, which is a lot more effective, is called dynamic rehearsal. And that's where you actually practice the skills, where you're reinforcing that muscle memory and practicing the skills that are complex psychomotor skills. In theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they really are not. So why do accidents occur? When people deviate from standard pre-dive preparation protocol. So I can be kind of an annoying person on a dive trip because I spend a lot of time not only preparing my equipment, but also familiarizing myself with the equipment of the people I dive with, because I want to see what equipment they have, because if I have to help somebody, I want to at least have some familiarity with it. Familiarity with that equipment before I get in the water with them. And now we come up to this thing called normalization of deviance. And normalization of deviance is a concept that I heard about first when I listened to the National Transportation Safety Board recommendations for the investigation of the Conception disaster, and then ultimately the investigation of the space shuttle disaster for both the space shuttle Columbia and the Challenger. So the Challenger disaster and the Columbia disaster. And they use the term normalization of deviance because those were deviations from standard operating procedures that became normalized over time. So for example, with the space shuttle, they knew the O-rings did not function well in cold weather, but they launched anyway, and it worked. And so they launched again and again, because even though they knew that it wasn't standard operating procedure to launch in cold weather, they did anyway, and it worked until it didn't, and the result was catastrophic. The same way with the Conception, because they had protocols on board that boat. That's where those people lost their lives because of the fire. And because of the fact that they would reinforce these deviations from their standard operating procedure, they continued until all of a sudden they had a problem that resulted in the loss of life. So they were rewarded when those deviations or their shortcuts work and don't result in a problem. And those shortcuts become normalized and normalized operating procedure over time. And they continue to work until they don't. So this was an article about the normalization of deviance that I wrote for the Diving Industry magazine for their April issue. So again, when shortcuts work, they work. When they don't, the results can be catastrophic. This is actually a screen grab off of a video where a lady was with a group of divers. That's the person here in the picture. And they had decided that they were going to make some changes in their normal procedure during the dive. And so when the dive was over, they turned and they gave each other the thumbs up, indicating the dive was over. And these people have been talking about the fact that they didn't want to have rapid ascents to the surface. And so therefore, they wanted to control their buoyancy and actually reduce their potential positive buoyancy by letting air out of their BC. The problem was this lady let all of the air out of her BC, and she started kicking. And you can see in this video that the other people are going to the surface, and she's kicking, and all of a sudden her fins hit the bottom because she actually went down rather than coming up. And as soon as her fins hit the bottom, she panicked, ripped her mask off, ripped the regulator out of her mouth, and clawed her way to the surface. And luckily, she survived. So every shortcut has a price, and sometimes that price is greater than any reward you can get from that shortcut. So again, why do accidents occur? Deviation from the standard pre-dive protocols, no pre-dive communication between diving companions, no pre-dive equipment check or evaluation, no use of the pre-dive checklist or pre-dive ritual to assure proper preparation. Also, we have to consider fitness to dive because we know that potential health issues, underlying health issues, or cardiac issues are a real problem. So divers over the age of 45 really should have an annual physical from a medical professional who's familiar with diving medicine and your life priorities. Now, your physician probably may not know anything about diving, and therefore they can get assistance from people like Divers Alert Network. But it's a good idea to tell your physician how important diving is to you, because if diving is an important part of your lifestyle, an important part of your life priorities, then your physician should know about that, because sometimes physicians err on the side of caution and will simply tell you to stop diving. I mean, I've gotten calls when I worked at Dan, got calls from people who were in their 60s where the doctor simply said, you know, you're 60, you should stop diving. And of course, that's ridiculous. So you can dive well into your 70s or 80s or even 90s if you're in good health. But the physician should know about your life priorities. And your physical should have a periodic cardiac evaluation. In fact, last year I went through mine to make sure everything was working properly, because I want to make sure that I'm in good health for the dives that I make. Or anytime there's a sudden or noticeable change in your health, whether it's physical or mental, you should seek assistance from your medical professional or your physician. Physical examination. You can get information if you don't have a physician who knows about diving medicine and you want to talk to somebody who knows about diving medicine. Divers Alert Network has a physician referral network that has over 700 physicians on it of all specialties. You can call them and they can give you a referral to that physician. Safe divers should always adhere to safety and conservative practices. The older I get, the more conservative I get. Dive within your limits and your experiences we talked about. Dive your recent experience, because it's a lot more important than the certification card you carry. Avoid diving conditions that may exceed your recent experience or abilities. This is a photo, for example, I took in Socorro a number of years ago, and it was a very windy day, very cold day, and there was a heavy current running. So my partner and I got up, we looked at the sea conditions, and we said, no, not today. And so we elected to stay on board the boat. So you can do that, because again, you are the only one that can make those decisions about your safety. Now, also, I suggest that divers, especially older divers, use enriched air nitrox with their dive computer set on the air setting, or if they're using dive tables, you use air dive tables, because that to me is conservative. That to me gives me a level of conservative that I'm very, very comfortable with. And in fact, nitrox use on dive boats is so frequently used now by older divers, it's been nicknamed geezer gas. So call it what you want. I don't care. I will use nitrox. In fact, I don't think I've made a dive on air in probably the last 6 or 7 years. So I would prefer to use nitrox on every dive that I make. And for one thing, you need to make sure that you understand what nitrox can do and can't do. So it's a good idea to take a nitrox specialty course in order to understand the benefits and certainly the limitations of using diving with nitrox. So use the most conservative options. I think it's a good idea to do that. Again, the older I get, the more conservative I get. Practice slow ascents, including safety stops. Over on the right-hand side, I'm doing my safety stop. My buddy is there floating around right behind me. You can see my buddy is in the full lotus position. That, by the way, is Dr. Jose Jones, who's the co-founder of the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. Fantastic diver. And so Jose he was 75. I think he had his 75th birthday on that trip. And he's there in the full lotus position. You can see that I'm not. I mean, I tried to get my legs up, and there's no way in the world I was as flexible as Dr. Jones. Be situationally aware, as we talked about before, your breathing gas supply, your bottom time, current depth visibility, position, location, workload, overhead environment, any of those things that can affect your safety and the safety of your buddy. Carry safety and signaling equipment. You can see the guy on the right-hand side there is Bob Evans, the guy who developed the force fin. Bob and I were diving together, and we were comparing our safety sausages. You can see that mine is bigger than his. Hey, we're talking about the safety sausages here. Mine is the Dan safety sausage, which, by the way, is the only one that has a metallic strip built into it, so it's visible on radar. Also, it's not a bad idea to have a surface float if you want some additional support at the surface. Divers also are carrying electronic devices to help them be located if they get separated from their dive boat. Nautilus Lifeline, I have nothing to do with them. I don't work with them at all. But they have Nautilus Lifeline that can be used to locate you. And when you come to the surface and activate it, it notifies all the boats within 15 kilometers there's a man overboard, and they can help find you. And also Garmin has one. In fact, on one of the last dive trips I was on, there were a number of people that had the Garmin device there that can be activated, and it gives a signal to the satellite network for initiation of air-sea rescue. And again, I'll carry one on a lot of the dives. This actually was a dive trip that I made to Tasmania a couple of years ago, and I have my Nautilus Lifeline with me. Take a break after multiple days of diving and multiple dives per day. There's no reason to roll. You have to do all the dives every day. You can. A lot of people do. But I tend to do a couple dives a day, whatever I'm comfortable with. And then whenever I feel tired, then I'll take a day off. Don't be afraid to ask for help, because you're paying people for assistance. So you're paying them to help you. So ask for help if you need it. Have an easy exit ladder with a pull-up bar. You can don and doff your equipment in the water. I've done that, especially if you have back problems, because that equipment is heavy coming out of the water. You might want to also consider different equipment options. Some people now are using side mounts, so that way they can put those cylinders on in the water, and it makes it a little bit easier, actually streamlines you a little bit. You can use smaller cylinders or large cylinders, 100 or more cubic feet down to 64 cubic feet or even smaller. You can also use lighter equipment. There's something called the Avelo diving system, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. The Avelo diving system is lighter, 15 pounds lighter than a standard 80. And the Avelo diving system is 15 pounds lighter than an 80. It's an aluminum wrapped cylinder, or it's a fiberglass wrapped aluminum cylinder. It is, again, lighter than a standard 80. And also the system is designed to allow you to take weight off of your weight belt. I was normally on the dive I was making, the test dives I did in Molokini in Hawaii. I normally was wearing about 16 pounds of lead. With the wetsuit I was wearing, I was actually down to 4 pounds of lead wearing the system. You wear no buoyancy compensator because it has internal buoyancy control. You can't do rapid ascents or descents because there's no rapid gas expansion or contraction, because again, you're not wearing a buoyancy compensator. You are much more streamlined in the water, and therefore it's a lot easier on you when you're getting in and out of the water. And in full disclosure, I do consult with Avelo as well. So safe divers should not be afraid to say no. Again, that's the best thing you can do, because you are the one who's responsible for your own safety. In fact, the article I just recently wrote in Diving Industry Magazine was about diver responsibility. You are the one responsible for your safety. So all you have to do is raise your thumb. The dive is over. You can call the dive even before you get in the water if necessary. I've done that. When I don't feel comfortable with the conditions, I'll sometimes say no, I'll just set out the dive. Remember, anyone can call a dive at any time for any reason. Just raise that thumb. Dive is over. This is the best thing I ever learned when I was trained as a cave diver. If returning to diving from a long absence, divers should be realistic about their health status. Consider a return to diving physical. In fact, actually, something else that I wrote about not too long ago was the need for medical clearance for diving. There are places now around the world that will require you to have medical clearance before they'll let you dive. So it's a good idea to check with the place you're going to see if they have any of those requirements. In fact, I'm going to my family physician here next week to get my physical. And what I do is I'll have that person give me a letter saying that in his opinion, I am fit to dive. And I carry that letter with me in case it's ever needed. Physicians should be familiar with diving medicine if possible, and your life priorities, as I mentioned. You also can consult with the Dan Medical Department, or have your physician consult with the Dan Medical Department if necessary. Refresh those skills and knowledge. This is actually a dive I did in southern Florida a number of years ago. I was actually diving with the Mel Fisher group, and they had invited on board a couple of people who were investors, and of course they had to go through a clearance first before they could do that, saying that they were qualified to dive. And this young lady did her entry and did a giant face plant in the ocean. So her skills were not as good as she said they were. And your skills do degrade over time. So a refresher course is necessary if you need it, and don't hesitate to take one. You know, they can be really good experiences. You can dive with an instructor, and that instructor can help you ease your way back into the water. Start with benign dives where you have clear visibility, plenty of bottom reference. A downline is really good because you can stop anytime you want. If you go in from the shore, you can stop at any depth, anytime along the way. So take your time getting back in the water if you've been away for a while. And dive in a familiar location, and be very, very, very conservative. So again, refresh your skills and knowledge, return to diving cautiously. This is an article I wrote for Dive Newswire that was literally about people coming to the sport post COVID. So your scuba diving safety, if it's not you, who then? Who's responsible for it? You are. You are the one responsible for your safety. You are the one that has to make all the decisions necessary to make that dive a safe dive.
Patient has a fractured fibula. Given him a mild sedative, so he can be able to go home tomorrow.
Daddy's gonna be so excited.
All good. That killed him.
So you got to use the equipment for the right purpose. So if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail, says Benjamin Franklin and any effective diver. So scuba diving safety is no accident. We want it to be no accident. We want to be able to have it be pure joy and enjoy the beauty of the underwater environment. So thank you to Valerie Ellerett and the Y-kiki Divers. The photos that were taken on our trip to the Arctic. So you have Valerie there on both those pictures, the right and the left. And then, of course, you also have Valerie, who is leading the conga line. So you probably didn't know how good her dancing skills really were. So you might have her demonstrate that sometime.
Okay.
And also, a lot of this information came from the book that my wife and I wrote, 101 Tips for Recreational Scuba Divers. That's available on Amazon. So any questions, and I'll stay as long as you need, and any questions that you have, I'll be happy to answer those to the best of my ability. So thank you all very, very much.
Yay.
If you can stop sharing the screen. I don't know how to stop sharing the screen here. Can you control that?
I think so.
I think we can. Dan, give us
Okay,
just a
that way I
second.
can see you, because right now all I'm doing is seeing myself.
Ready? Here we go. And 1, 2, 3. Whoa.
Oh, come on. Give me the stupid little screen back.
Thanks, Dan, for sharing that Congo line picture.
Sorry.
Very surprised.
I did have a video of that, but I'm not that good with video, so I didn't put the video.
The other one you could have shared was with me doing the polar plunge. That would have
Polar
been
plunge.
funny.
I had those two, and I could. There were a lot of them actually, Valerie. I could have shown.
You could use against me. Yeah. Yeah.
So were you able to stop? Were you able to stop the sharing?
Yes.
I think they have been able to, but although it's still up on the screen, so
Yeah.
well.
Oh, here we go. There you go. I can see it. Okay.
Good.
Any questions?
All right. Do we have any questions? Hold on. John Mullen has a question for you, Dan.
Okay.
Occurs to me at several points along the way, you talk about divers that feeling bad or their health is not good and so on. But I think it would be good to make a whole bullet point out of comfort. As you go in the water, as you first start with the water and so on, are you comfortable? Have you got a ball of gas down in your guts that you're hoping will go away? Or your boots isn't on right and it's beginning to wear a spotted foot and it's distracting you and you kind of, the longer you go, the farther it is to get back to the boat. Comfort.
So I do agree with that. So he's saying, maybe not wait until you think that it's a major problem, but just your overall comfort. I remember one of the things for me was an aha moment was if I ever feel like I have anxiety, that I need to solve that problem. So maybe add a little bit of air into the BCD because I was like hyperventilating, trying to stay buoyant or something, or having to swim to stay buoyant, or could have been something simple like that, or just ending the dive, where you got to just sort of call it. So I think what really impresses me about your presentation, Dan, is making it not only is it you and your dive buddy, but it's also a personal decision to know who you are and where you're at in the dive and to respond accordingly.
Yeah. Well, when you speak of comfort, in fact, a number of years ago, there was a philosophy or a saying to look down when you dive. And that means that when you get in the water, put your face in the water, because there are people, and you've probably seen them, who are very uncomfortable. When they get in the water, they try to keep their head above the surface. Even though they have a regulator in their mouth, they keep their head above the surface because they're really uncomfortable. So the philosophy was that once you get in the water, the first thing to do is put your face in the water, look down to the bottom, which will calm you down a little bit. And then some people, when you talk about inflating your BC, some people will then inflate their BC at the surface because the squeeze of that BC gives them some comfort, because it's like having somebody's arms wrapped around them. So being comfortable in the water is extremely important. You're absolutely right about that.
I think we have a question from Pat.
Okay.
Can I just talk?
Yep.
Okay. Hi. My name's Pat Huff, and I have a question. I have a question about the nitrox. I pretty exclusively dive nitrox if I'm traveling, and I have. There are two opinions out there on all kinds of different boats from the professionals that if you dive nitrox and you have an accident, but you've set it on air standing, not nitrox standing, then it'll be hard to sort out your profile. So I know what you said to do for safety and to increase your being more conservative. I was shocked that that's happened really recently, quite often.
Yeah, that in fact, if somebody told me that, I wouldn't believe them, because I don't think it makes any sense.
Okay.
I don't think if you have a dive computer and they know the breathing gas you're mixing, or that you're using, the mix that you're using, 32% or 36% or whatever it to be, and they know your dive profile, they can sort all that out. So it really would have nothing to do with your ability to be treated.
Okay. Well, I didn't mean treatment. I think they meant figuring it out afterwards if you die. Here's my other question.
Okay.
If I'm diving nitrox because I want to extend my bottom time because I want to dive 4 dives, then if I leave it on air, I'm not going to really expand my dive time. And then if my buddy is diving nitrox and has it on 32 or 28, whatever we're diving, and I set mine on air, then we're going to be in conflict from our deco standings. Is that accurate, or am I just not understanding my computer right?
Your buddy who's breathing air would go into deco sooner than you would.
No, they're leaving nitrox, but they're set on 32% on their computer. I'm diving nitrox and I have it on air.
And your computer would be more conservative, Pat.
Yeah, you would definitely be more.
It'll be more conservative, but when we want to, but eventually I'm going to run out of time to dive.
So,
in my opinion, I would choose a different buddy.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So, hold on just a second. Let me interject something, because this actually happens with me. So as a dive company, usually when you sign up a trip with me, I include nitrox, right? I feel that passionate about nitrox. And I have had that issue, exactly what Pat is describing, which is one person is diving on air tables, but fails to tell their buddy. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that come up until about Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
Tuesday or Wednesday of the dive vacation. And so that has caused a genuine problem where that person, and especially they haven't told me or the other dive crew that they're on air tables. So my recommendation is to communicate that if that is what you were doing, if you were diving nitrox but diving on air tables, that you make sure and make that known both to your dive buddy and to the dive guides and your fellow divers, because everybody else is diving nitrox and I'm all about the same, nitrogen load. And then all of a sudden, they're not really paying attention to where you might be on air tables. And so, you're not in any danger per se, but your computer thinks you're in danger, right? So
well, I understand. I understand that cognition wise. It's just frustrating because, I'm not getting any younger. So if I choose to do that for safety, then I'm also maybe not going to be able to make that last dive in about 3 days. So that's a challenge and a frustration for me.
Yeah, that's what you got to accept, Miss Patricia Ann. I love you, but that's exactly, if you decide to do that, that's what you got to do. It's just like Dan says, you got to call the dive and not make that third dive and go have a cocktail instead.
Yeah.
Well, no, I can do that. That's not a problem.
And it really
Good.
comes down to what we talked about communication, because you really need to effectively communicate with the people you dive with. And so the people I dive with know exactly, and I know exactly what they're doing, and they know what I'm doing. So there's no misinformation there at all. I want to know what they're breathing. I want to know how their computer is set, because if I have to help them, I want to know everything I can about that person, which is sometimes a challenge because I don't always travel with the same person. So my wife doesn't dive as frequently now as she did before because she has some ear issues. But I'll choose a buddy when I go on a trip somewhere. When I go to Cayman next week, I don't know any of those people, and I'm going to be diving with somebody who's brand new. So I spend time talking to the person that I'm going to dive with, and we share all that information. I don't want to hide anything or not tell them anything about what I'm doing and how I'm doing it and why I'm doing it. And if my buddy is not willing to do that, then I'll choose somebody else.
Thanks.
I would like to also offer up, it's like, Dan, what you're talking about is the exact situation I was going to say. If you're on a dive trip and maybe you don't have a buddy you came with and you get paired up with somebody, obviously you need to have confidence in yourself as a diver, but you also need to have confidence in your buddy. And if you're getting geared up and they're talking about things and this and that, and you're not comfortable with that person, you need to talk to the dive staff and see about getting a different buddy.
Yeah. Nobody, for one thing, nobody is going to assign me a buddy. I'm going to dive with somebody of my choosing. So if all of a sudden there's a group of people, I'll talk to them and I'll find somebody that I think is compatible. I'll talk to them about the dives that I've done, dives they're doing and have done. And then I'll dive with the person that I'm comfortable with. And so I'm not going to have somebody come up to me and say, well, you're diving with this person. No, I'm not going to do that. I'll dive with whoever I want to dive with. I haven't lived this long to put myself at risk.
So Dan, we have a case study I think that would be interesting to share. And Brian, do you mind coming up and sharing our incident with you? With the group? Hold on.
So in April, we did a dive trip to Socorro, and the Socorro regulations, so on the trip, they asked you to be advanced certified. My sister and brother-in-law were going to go on the trip. My brother-in-law was not advanced certified. We found this out kind of in the last month that it was a requirement. So we called them and they said, look, you have half our staff were dive instructors. We had all the dive masters on the boat. They're like, look, they don't need to be advanced certified. They hadn't been in the water for a little bit. So I said, let's get in the water anyway. And I did their advanced certification 2 weeks prior to going to Socorro.
At Mermet.
At Mermet. They had just bought all new gear, just bought new 7mm wetsuits. We go down, do the advanced certification, and 2 weeks later, we head out to Socorro. So I tell all my engineers that most major failures are a series of small mistakes. Just like Dan was saying in the very beginning, there are a lot of small things. So just kind of stack these things up as I go through the series of events. So they're newer divers, new equipment, just got advanced certification, and we head out to Socorro. First sets of dives start out of the gate, 100 feet.
It's blue water,
it's
right?
blue water.
Socorro is blue water.
Deep water diving. So all coming out of Zodiacs. So we take the Zodiacs out, we dive. Just like Dan said, I did my first dive without my dive camera. I have a big camera. I dive with all the time as much as I can, but I'm like, okay, I'm going to dive with you guys first dive, kind of a checkout dive. So I dive with them. They were bouncing off of their NDL limits through that first dive. As they were coming up, they did not have their dive weighting exactly correct. So when they came up, my sister could not hold her safety stop. My brother-in-law grabbed a hold of her. They kind of busted through the safety stop, went to the surface. Now, no harm, no foul, didn't hit an NDL. We had long surface intervals between the second dive. They pull the weights out. You have to pull the weights out, hand it into the Zodiac. They take you back to the boat. Everyone takes the weights off. They're all in a big pile. Everyone finds their weights with their names on it, puts it back in their gear. Their weights didn't have names on it, all new gear. They get their weights switched when they get put into their gear for dive 2. So dive 2 takes place. They did okay on dive 1. They were comfortable, had a great dive, missed the safety stop.
Did you mention the mantis?
Beautiful mantas. by the way.
Beautiful mantas. So that's another problem, by the way, right? Truly, right?
And
Great
there's camera.
mantas on the dive, right? So lots of distracting from.
Lots of distractions. So we get ready to do dive 2. I have a conversation with you. Can't miss your safety stops on these deep dives. Just don't miss them. And if someone's going to miss them, you can't go chase them to the surface. Sean, don't grab her. Let her go. You have to do your safety stop. So we have a very detailed conversation. First mistake on my part was not doing a weight check with them when we get back in the water off the Zodiac. So second mistake I made is I dove with my camera on the second dive after they checked out. Those were my mistakes. But so we get in, they're doing their dive, they're buddies. Again, I notice I'm shooting pictures of mantas and stuff like that, but I notice that they're a good 10, 15 feet deeper than me. They're again bouncing off that. And I'm looking at my dive profile and I'm like, I'm kind of right there. They're a little bit deeper. Again, coming up in that second dive, she can't hold her safety stop again. He grabs a hold of her and they both bust through the second safety stop on dive 2, bouncing off their NDLs on the second dive. So get out, no big deal, no problem. They're doing great, have dinner. He goes in and then takes a hot shower that evening and comes out.
Yeah.
He notices a rash start coming across his chest. Luckily, we have a dive doctor, also our master dive instructor on the boat. We get his attention and bring it up. So my brother-in-law starts going through, decompression sickness. So the great part about it, a couple things, is just the series of small events that took place. Now, if I would have paid good attention, we kind of saw it, that they were hitting their NDLs, they missed their first safety stop, just maybe skip the second dive. That would have solved the problem. Or do the weight check when you get up to the Zodiac. That could have made a difference there. But at the end of the day, they had Dan Insurance, a $60,000 bill from a private jet picking them up off of the Socorro Island to fly them out, and 2 sessions within a decompression chamber in Cabo.
Both of them.
Just no, because my sister that missed her safety stop twice was fine. Sean, who grabbed a hold of her and busted through, holding her because he was fine on his weights and just in his weight
He
control.
could have held this.
He could have kept his weight and just let her go. She was fine. If he would have just done the safety stops, again, probably wouldn't have a problem. So if you could break the chain in any one of those scenarios, we could have probably solved the problem. But again, at the end of the day, dive with Dan Insurance because they were going down the wrong road of trying to solve this problem. We said, stop, call Dan. Dan took over, managed everything, and it made it a beautiful scenario. He had no issues. 2 days later, they were sitting on the beach. He's fine, but $60,000 bill later, and missing the rest. It was day 1, missing the rest of diving with mantas, and a fairly expensive trip down the drain. They learned a lot. All the dive instructors, we all learned a lot from the same scenario. But again, all those little things that he talked about that create those accidents just stacked up and created that incident.
Wait, why didn't he get a rash? What was that caused from?
That's one of the major signs of decompression. Sickness.
So it's basically a nitrogen bubbles coming out of solution underneath the subcutaneous of your skin and stuff like that. Yeah. So it's almost like getting punched or whatever. So you get a rash that develops, and it sometimes comes around your waist area. It develops in different parts of your body. But that is a telltale sign of decompression sickness. So in this case, right, just like he's saying, a very fun day. Everybody's having a great time. Mantas, yay, yay, yay. They did all the right things. They did advanced open water before they left. They got new equipment. They were super excited. They had their instructor brother on the trip, right? And so, it goes to show you exactly what Dan is talking about, which is a lot of small things leading up to a diving accident that in this case could have been prevented. Like, perhaps just sitting out that second dive, that would have lowered the nitrogen load and put them in a better position of safety.
Or weight check.
Or weight check, right?
They explained, again, the communication, they didn't bring it up that, hey, we had an issue with our weights. They didn't tell everybody.
Because they're a little embarrassed because they're new.
They're new.
They're
so they kind
new.
of kept it between them.
Right? Yep.
And and they just dealt with it, but the weights got switched. So not only did they not have the right weights to begin with, they also ended up with other people's weights. So just, again, make sure you're ready.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
My question is, was there an option of doing that first dive in a different location? Did they
No.
have to do the first dive? No, really.
No.
Was that a Nautilus boat?
Yeah.
It was the Valentina.
Valentina.
The Valentina.
Yeah, it wasn't Nautilus.
No.
Yeah, because I've been a scorer myself, and the first thing that I do when I go on their boats is I meet with the dive staff, and I want to know what the schedule is. And one of the boats that I was on, one of the trips I was on, there were a number of Navy guys on there, who had a lot of experience. One of the guys was a Navy SEAL, and so I met with the dive staff, and I said, "Well, what's the first dive?" And they said, "Well, considering the experience," and they didn't know these people from Adam, the experience of everybody, we're going to do this. And I said, "Well, no. We need to do what you're supposed to do on the first dive, which is do an orientation or familiarization dive to get everybody used to the water, use the equipment they're wearing, use the equipment they're using. And it's got to be in a very benign location." So I told them we're going to do it in a place that's no deeper than 40 feet. And that's what we did. We just changed the schedule. And I do that whenever I'm on a boat with other people, whether I'm in charge or not. I want to know where that first dive is going to be, because I'm going to be making that first dive. And I don't want it to be in a challenging location either. I want it to be in a place where I can relax, enjoy myself, get my confidence the way it should be, get my equipment where it should be, and not put myself at risk. And so I think, people need to have that option. You need to make sure that you understand that first dive with people should be in a place where it's pretty benign.
And then to add to it, Dan, we added the magic of mantas,
Yeah.
right? So that causes you're distracted, you're not paying attention.
Oh,
if
yeah.
you're a new diver, you're like trying to you're trying to look at them and you're sinking, kind of a thing. Yeah, all of these things. In this case, it was not a near miss. It was actually. He did ended up getting hurt, but is okay. And so we've talked about it at length personally, and then of course in staff meetings to help us be better and to advise better. And I like your idea. It is not something that I have done, but I certainly will incorporate that into my.
I tend to be kind of an annoying person on a boat, because not only do I want to meet with the dive staff, even though I may not be in charge, I want to know what they're going to do. But I spend time making sure there's oxygen on the boat. I'll open the oxygen unit to make sure that there is oxygen in that cylinder, and it is something that is complete, because we had to use it on that trip to the Arctic. And I want to make sure there's an AED on board if necessary. And I'll even look at their first aid kits to see what's on board, because I want to make sure if there's a crisis that takes place, I don't want to have to be scrambling around to make sure I can help people. I want to make sure the equipment is there that should be there to be able to deal with whatever the situation is.
My husband is famous for saying, "Not what you expect, it's what you inspect."
Inspect.
Well, and it should be, those first dives should be a checkout dive. And when I teach rescue class, and we're talking about when everybody has to prepare emergency action plans, I tell everybody in my rescue class, I'm like, when you're going on a dive trip, you're going on a boat, whether it's a liveaboard or you're going out with somebody, you ask those people to show you your emergency action plan and make sure they have stuff and they're prepared.
Yeah, good idea. Good idea.
So Dan, that's Cindy Schrader. She's our course director on staff.
Oh, good.
So
Good.
she's got lots and lots of rescue classes. Yes, thank you, Cindy.
Good way to do things.
Yes, sir.
In your case, you had the last item in the chain of things was taking a hot shower. Had you had that night, but had you not had that hot shower, would you still suffer?
Don't know.
So that's a big what if, right? We don't know. But one of the things we do talk about is when you're diving, is not to take a hot shower right after exertion and stuff like that. What it does is it brings your blood to the surface and could potentially trigger a DCS event.
It's right where the shower head's hitting. You don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, he was right on that borderline.
Yeah, that's why.
The whole time.
And we're all individuals, as this case particularly outlines. His wife did okay, but he himself was a different. It's a dive theory. It's not. We're all individuals. We all have different body mass and different ways of off-gassing and loading nitrogen. So, yeah, for sure.
And the same thing goes for hot tubs.
Hot tubs. Yeah, you know, like on liveaboards that have hot tubs, I'm always, you know, of course you want to, you know, like slide into one of those. That sounds like a great idea, but truly it's not a good idea. Unfortunately.
The rash was from the shower.
Oh, no. It's the rashes from diving and the nitrogen and stuff like that. So
Well, you got a new 7 mil wetsuit. You're driving a Mermet. A lot of times you don't empty your tank of Mermet. You might only have a half a tank when you come up, but you don't, unless you get down to 5 pounds, you don't know what your buoyancy is going to be.
That's true. So what he's saying is at our local rock quarry, Dan, you know, you might not get a very good sense of your buoyancy because you very rarely empty your cylinder. On a big dive, I call those big boy dives, by the way, big boy dives where there's blue water. Yeah, you'll drain your cylinder and quite rapidly, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a low cylinder, and you've got to combat that problem, right? That's the buoyancy problem. Absolutely.
Yep.
So I do want to make mention, Dan, as you were talking about the human factor involved, one of the gals that was on our Antarctica trip is Ashley Boogie, and she lost her husband on a routine, it was a rebreather course, and it was that same thing that you were alluding to. He forgot to turn his diluent on as he jumped in, and essentially everybody was, you know, they were accustomed to XYZ, and so they weren't paying attention to him. He could have been saved, and she lost her husband with 2 kids and a third on the way. And her story is told in if you go to the humanfactor.org, she's trying to make her experience as public as possible to help prevent future mistakes like that. And she will be at our next meeting, and she's with, they've got a new nonprofit entity that she's joined up with Tiffany Duong, and that's going to be Seabirds Foundation, and that's going to be the next meeting in October is going to be the Seabirds, and Ashley will be on our call in October. So, yeah, so pretty.
Her YouTube video is great to watch.
I agree. That video is great to watch because she's tried very hard to take his accident, make it as public as possible, as raw as that might be for her personally, but to share it, kind of like Ryan's doing with our case here, you know, our near miss really, and try to learn from it, you know. So, I watch a lot of the air disaster videos where in the air industry, they actually review accidents to the nth degree to try to, like you say, learn from any of those mistakes. And like Dan's doing, try to share those mistakes so we don't make those same mistakes, right? There's a lot of these cases, it's something so simple, right? And it's just a tragedy. And we look at that and go, gosh, how did that happen? It's really easy, actually, very easy being complacent. So
and that's why I use those case histories, because those are learning experiences, and they may seem like, why would somebody not fully connect their BCD? It happens a lot. Yeah,
absolutely. Or when I'm looking at somebody like across from me, like even on a Zodiac, Dan, I'm like, whoa, hold on just a second. You can see something that's not quite right. Maybe they can't see it from their vantage point, but you can see it, you know. So being vigilant and that sort of thing. So. Do we have
and also, I mean, dive professionals do make mistakes. Dive professionals sometimes will do the wrong thing. In fact, there's a case that took place up in Montana where a person was taking an advanced course, and they didn't have a wetsuit to fit her, so they put her in a dry suit. She'd never worn a dry suit before. They didn't have an inflator for the dry suit, so they didn't attach it to the regulators, so there was no way to control buoyancy in the dry suit. So they overweighted her, got separated from her buddy, and went over a ledge and drowned.
She was young.
Yeah, she was.
Yeah, that was very tragic for sure. So
could I jump in real quick? I had maybe I'd like to describe like an upcoming dive I'm going to be doing in actually like 4 days to Dan and the group. See if I'm missing something, or if there's a question or an area that you think I should look into. So basically, And Valerie, I dove last year with your shop at Blackbird Cay, I think it was. Yep. I've been out of the water since then, and I've since moved down here to Austin, Texas, and I've been kind of angry at myself for not getting in the water yet this year. And I recently saw a paper an article in the paper about this lake just to the west here of Austin, Lake Travis, and they're going to do a cleanup. They do a cleanup every September, that I found out. So I thought, oh, I can get a quick dive in this year. I'll feel like I've gotten a dive in. And so I'm going to go do that this coming Sunday. There's a number of dive groups going to be participating. It's a lake dive, of course. So I've been speaking with a couple of the different dive shops. I've kind of picked my dive shop that I wanted to go with. Now, to your earlier point, I don't think I'm going to get to choose my buddy because I'm going to be going with them alone. So that's one thing that you brought up that I'm wanting to be aware of. The visibility is going to be pretty bad, of course. Luckily, I think we're only going to be going max of maybe even just 30 feet. So I'm comfortable with it not being a super deep dive to the bottom of the lake or anything like that. Thermoclines, I've inquired a lot about, thermoclines, visibility, what's the dive plan. It's going to be a cleanup. So there's going to be an activity involved, right? So I'm thinking even about that. Like, am I going to be given a bat? What's all involved in the dive? So I think I'm doing a lot of research and trying to be safety conscious, but kind of giving you that description, would there be anything you would ask the dive shop, or if you were in my situation, how would you handle it?
Yeah, I think, and I've done things like that before. And what I do is, if possible, try to meet the people beforehand, so you have some idea of somebody you may be compatible with. If not, then once I get there, and I try to get there early, so once people start getting there, I'll start talking to people and find somebody I think may be compatible. And then, if it's maybe my first dive in a year, I'll say, well, is there one of you who may be working closer to the shore, where it's a little bit shallower water, rather than going out into the deeper water right away? And then I'll probably put myself with that person, maybe for the first dive. And again, find somebody who I feel I'm compatible with, spend a little bit of time talking to them about the equipment they use, look at their equipment. And I'd also make sure there is some safety gear on site to make sure that one of the dive stores is bringing at least an oxygen unit to the site. But then talk to somebody in that. If you feel that you can handle that in very shallow water, if you want to stay with the same person on the next dive, you can do that. If not, you could possibly change to somebody else, do a little bit deeper water. But again, I would do it slowly and actually work my way deeper rather than going out to the deeper water first.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
And I would say, if you have your own gear and you haven't dove it in a year or so, you'd want to get your gear looked at and maintenance and make sure everything's functional and you haven't had dry rot with any of the O-rings or any of that kind of stuff in your gear too.
Yeah.
Excellent point. Yeah. And in fact, I'm going to be going by the dive shop to get my tank from them prior to Sunday. So they even said, hey, bring in your regulators. We'll take a look at them, which I appreciated them offering that. And so I'll probably take my bag of, I have all my own gear. So I'll take my bag there and do a little inspection, have a talk with them on Saturday, and, maybe just have a full on pre-dive kind of conversation.
Does that dive store have a pool?
Yeah. Do they have a pool?
Does the dive store have a pool?
So see, that's something I don't know. I know they're in the city, and I think they're in more of a strip mall situation, so probably not on location.
Yeah, you might want to check with them, because maybe there's a possibility of getting in the pool first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but Corey, what I really like about this conversation is that you're thinking about it, right? You're putting some thought into it.
That's really a good thing to do, because you're gathering the information you need. You're gathering the information you need to make decisions about your safety and the people you dive with. So, done.
No, I appreciate that. I think it's good to have a healthy level of fear. You should control your fear. You should have a full understanding of your fear, but I think you should have a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, it helps.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Today. So.
Hey, anything else?
It's about 8:30 tonight, Dan. So I think I don't think we have any questions online. No.
7:30.
Okay.
Yeah, 7:30 for me.
Hey, Val.
Yes, Penn.
This is Bill Jones. I have a
hi,
question,
Bill. I'm
Dan.
sorry, Bill.
Okay, Bill.
Have you had any experience with a diver that develops headaches after surfacing? Very shortly after surfacing. It doesn't matter the profile, deep, shallow, long, short.
Yeah, there have been. Sometimes you get, what's called a sphenoid sinus squeeze. It's the sphenoid sinus is deep in your skull, and that can give you a headache. Sometimes just cold water. Yeah, it's not uncommon for people to have a little bit of a headache.
This is a perpetual from years and years.
Well, you might want to talk to your doctor about that.
Yeah. Nitrox seem to help it.
Oh, interesting.
I know for me, in the beginning, when I was first diving, I was breathing related. So I'm going to say it was a little bit of carbon, not expelling my carbon dioxide kind of a thing, giving me a headache.
Yeah, and in fact, it's not a bad idea to actually pick up the phone and call the medical department of Dan, because they can give you some information. But again, I would probably have her talk to her physician about that. Because maybe
I've been trying to get them to talk to Dan and haven't been successful yet. So I may have to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Push a little harder.
Thank you. And in fact, you've got my email address on there. It's danor@danorconsulting.com. If you drop me an email and tell me about that situation again, I'll look and see what I can find, and I'll be happy to send you whatever information I can find.
So guys, the way I like to describe Dan is I like to describe him as our personal ambassador to all things scuba. So I've reached out to Dan on numerous occasions, and I'm like, hey Dan, I got this problem. Who do I talk to in the diving industry? And Dan's like, hold on, I got a contact for you. And Dan and his wife Betty couldn't be any more generous with their time and their contributions to our sport, our activity here. So again, I want to thank Dan. I want to thank his wife Betty for your tremendous hospitality, for always being such good-natured folks, answering my calls, saying, "Hey, could you please speak to my folks?" It's always tell us another story, Dan. You've got such a presence. We really enjoy your stories.
Most of which are true.
Yeah, most of which are true. I love that. Yes. So, yes.
They have great nurses on staff also.
And they also have great nursing staff at Dan as well. So, yeah. So all the people at Dan are tremendously generous of their time. They want to keep our community safe. That's their whole. That's their passion, and we're grateful to have them. Absolutely.
Spent 23 years working there. I loved every minute of it.
Amen. We loved having you, and we love having you as our ambassador today. So, everybody, if you would please join me in thanking Dan.
Thank you. Thank you all. And again, if you have a question, drop me an email.
Yes, and I will send out your email, and I appreciate you, Dan, as always, for answering my call.
Appreciate it. Appreciate
Good night, everybody. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.